Laura Rosenberger, the director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Laura, on your Twitter feed, you have a shorter description of yourself. In addition to being a Steelers fan and a feminist and Jewish, you also note that you're a protector of democracy. What does that mean?
So for me, as you noted, a whole bunch of identities there, but I think one of the things that we have realized in the past few years is that democracy is not something that we can just reap the benefits of, but that we actually have to actively take a role in strengthening and defending. Our democracy faces challenges from within and from without. And as somebody who's devoted my life to national security, it's become increasingly clear to me that threats to our democracy are threats to our security. And for me, it's something that I've decided to take on in this chapter of my career.
What is democracy for you when you come to protecting it?
Democracy is certainly a system of government. It's a system of laws, a rule of law that maintains that democratic system. But it's also a system of norms. It's a practice. It's something that each and every day citizens of democracy need to engage in, whether that is the ability to have healthy debates with people with whom we disagree, whether that is respect for things like truth and the ability to be discriminating about information, or whether that is abiding by decisions that come out of our court system, because we believe that that is actually the practice that should contribute to a healthy democracy. I think it is really all of the above.
How is the outside world undermining American democracy?
So I think one of the things that we've seen in the past decade in particular is that authoritarian regimes, illiberal forces, have begun to understand that attacking not just our borders, not just our people, but attacking our system, right? The very political system, the way of life that you described, our culture, that these are targets where they can actually weaken us from within. And they are using a range of tools.
So Laura, let's be a bit more specific. Who are they?
So I think the biggest actors we see in this space at the moment, Russia, obviously, Vladimir Putin's Russia in particular, has really taken a pretty aggressive stance in attacking not just American democracy, but democracies across the European continent and potentially more broadly. We see the Chinese Communist Party beginning to adopt a different, a strategy that appears a little bit different, but that is similarly aimed at undermining democracy and the rule of law outside of its borders as a way of advancing the Chinese model for global governance.
Is this a new Cold War?
No, I don't believe it's a new Cold War. I guess what I would say is I think it's lazy when people talk about this as a new Cold War. People kind of just want to point to something they know and apply that label to what we see today. The Cold War was unique for a number of different reasons. One, the US and Soviet Union were both superpowers.
Well, they still are, aren't they?
I don't believe Russia is a superpower. Russia is an objectively declining power. By every measure, its economy is shrinking, its population is declining, its influence globally is declining. What I think we're seeing right now is Vladimir Putin playing a very weak hand very, very well, using a series of low-cost tools that can have an asymmetric effect when targeted at democracies.
So why is Putin doing it, Laura? What's he up to here? Okay, I buy your idea that he's playing his hand well, but does he just want to weaken the United States and Western Europe, or is there a longer-term plan?
Well, I think what Vladimir Putin cares about is Vladimir Putin. And his sort of long-term goal is maintaining power and influence. That also includes maintaining his wealth, because that is in part the source of his power. Russia as I just noted, is a declining power. And so one of Vladimir Putin's, stated goals to his people is to restore Russia to its previous greatness. He believes that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest sort of, tragedy in history. And so, restoring Russia to its previous position of power and influence is a goal of his and something he's sold to his people. But he can't do that in a sort of objective way, right? I mean, if we look at relative power, the relative power of Russia is going to continue to decline. So the only way for Putin to actually gain power for Russia is to weaken others, right? And so weakening others is a real part of that. That includes weakening individual countries like the United States that Putin sees as competitors. That includes weakening international institutions he sees as threats like NATO and the EU. But that also means, facilitating, kleptocratic rule in order to maintain his wealth and influence.
So it's a kind of political terrorism, just an attempt to destroy.
That's an interesting frame. Yeah, I hadn't actually thought of that terminology, but that is certainly one way of thinking about it. I mean,
and there's a sort of a nihilistic element behind it. No real long-term plan. Just he's weak, we're strong, so he just wants to weaken us.
I think that's a pretty good summary. I mean, there's a couple of other elements, I think that are driving him, right? Discrediting democracy as a system is also certainly something he's interested in.
Yeah.
Putin's always seen democracy as a threat. He's always believed that, the United States is trying to undermine him by promoting democratic forces within Russia. Going back to his KGB roots, right? Going after democracies was certainly part of his history. But he's also, Putin had made a promise to his people, essentially saying, when he took power, I will bring you economic prosperity if you give me the ability to rule with a pretty firm fist. And so he's kind of not made good on that promise. And so he needs other ways to be able to discredit democracy as a system to his people.
But isn't it also fair that he's investing in, again, quote unquote, democratic forces? His people were supporting Brexit. They support Le Pen. They're behind Orban in Hungary and perhaps the Northern League in Italy. And these are all, they may be illiberal, but they're not necessarily undemocratic, or at least they play the game of democratic politics.
Well, the groups you just listed all are pretty, they're not monolithic, so I would be a little hesitant to ascribe one description to that set of forces. But what we see there is a desire to create cleavages within democratic systems, right? Or within alliances. And so, there are, one of the things we've seen, Russia's government forces get behind is various separatist movements, right? And again, that's about sort of creating sort of cleavages or wedges within societies.
You said that Russia isn't a superpower, and I think that's debatable. Certainly the Russians wouldn't agree, but others might. China is a superpower. And I know you feel that in some ways that the China threat, and that's my term, not yours, the China threat to democracy is in the long term more worrying, more severe than the Russian one. So what are the Chinese up to here?
China is a rising power. And
it's a superpower,
China,
right?
I mean, I'm not a political scientist who's going to get into the debates about. I am.
Well, America is a superpower. If America's a superpower, then China is one as well, isn't it?
Well, I think we're sort of splitting hairs here. If you want to get into superpower questions, it's a question of are we in a bipolar system or a multipolar system or this or that? And so to me, that's sort of not the point. The point is China is an objectively rising power that has an interest
global, regional and global, right?
I believe regional and global. This is, there is debate within, China scholar circles about the extent to which China's strategy is regional or global in focus, but I certainly believe it is global. And the Chinese Communist Party has a long-term interest in shaping the international context in a way that is favorable to its system. And that means, as sort of Xi Jinping has defined it, making the world more hospitable to authoritarianism, and undermining or weakening the pillars of democratic institutions, rule of law, where it is perceived as being sort of in the way of China's growth and ascension.
So this is the surveillance authoritarianism that's being architected in China right now.
That's certainly one part of it. It's a significant part of it. There's other elements to it, but the high-tech authoritarianism that that the Chinese Communist Party is really adopting and perfecting and testing at home is something that we're starting to see the groundwork being laid for it to be exported abroad.
Are they investing in Facebook groups, amplifying the kneeling debate in the NFL, or are they being a bit more sophisticated, the Chinese?
So we haven't seen the same kind of activity by sort of Chinese information operations on social media that is widely used in sort of Western democracies.
So what should we worry about them if they're not corrupting Facebook? Are they doing something more damaging?
Well, I think they're using a different set of tactics. So, we do see activity by what appear to be sort of mainland-driven information operations on Chinese origin platforms. So, for instance, the chat app WeChat is sort of the most commonly used chat app by Chinese speakers. And we have seen numerous instances of disinformation being spread on WeChat. China also
What kind
conducts,
of disinformation?
Certainly we've seen instances where there's false information being spread about politicians in different countries. There hasn't been enough research to really be able to pinpoint exactly where it comes from, so I want to be a little careful. But I do think that there is a lot of cause for concern there. But the other part of it that I think is equally important when it comes to the way China uses information operations is not in the deployment of information, but in the denial of information. So China doesn't just seek to sort of put out information that sort of is aimed at shifting the debate, but they also engage in a significant amount of censorship in order to essentially deny conversation that they don't want to be happening, right?
Inside or outside China?
Both. So it used to be that this kind of activity was really just within China. The Great Firewall, of course, is how the Chinese censorship system of the internet is often referred to. But this application I mentioned, WeChat, we have now seen Chinese censors actually censoring conversation on what they deem to be sensitive topics outside of China's borders. And I think that this is just the beginning of a broader effort by the Chinese Communist Party to shape discourse and debate outside of China's borders.
So you would see things like WeChat or perhaps Huawei as not just as Chinese commercial enterprises, but actual threats to democracy?
I would be careful in describing WeChat itself as a threat to democracy. I certainly think it's the way that the Chinese Communist Party and its censors have been able to use and manipulate WeChat conversation. Huawei is a bit of a different question because of the capabilities that it provides the Chinese intelligence services in terms of both data collection and in terms of, frankly, creating long-term dependencies in other systems. So I've recently been using an analogy that comes out of sort of the defense world. So the United States, when we sell military aircraft to other countries, it's decisions and relationships that don't just involve a one-off selling of an airplane. Usually it's a group of airplanes. But it will involve maintenance packages that create a relationship with US companies. It will involve the need to buy interoperable component parts, right? So whether that's the weapons systems that go on to the aircraft, whether that's ground equipment that's necessary to maintain an aircraft fleet. But there's a whole sort of set of dependencies that go along with selling military weapon systems. Huawei is somewhat similar in the sense of, what the Chinese government is seeking to do is not just, create space for 5G technology in other countries, but actually create an environment where countries have no other option but to go back and use Chinese applications that are the only ones that will work and operate on Huawei systems, right?
So data might not, people talk about data as the new oil of the 21st century. It's also the new missile of the 21st century,
I
the
think
new
that's
the
exactly
new form
right.
of warfare. So, Laura, you've laid out a terrifying world in terms of the threat to democracy. What do we do? How do we fix it?
Well, I think there's a number of different elements to it. One is that we can't allow ourselves to be divided. We need to recognize that democracy functions by having conversations with people where we may or may not agree. The Alliance for Securing Democracy, the program that I direct here, it's a bipartisan effort. So I think that is one, recognizing that that democracy cannot be a partisan issue. We must stand together in order to defend it, number one. Number two, I think we need to recognize that a lot of the ways that our democracy is being attacked is by exploiting vulnerabilities that we have allowed to grow and fester within. And so strengthening ourselves from within, closing off those vulnerabilities is one of the best things we can do. I think we need to get a real handle on technology and the impact it's having on democracy.
Shut the internet down, Laura?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I believe that it's striking for me, having been in government during the Arab Spring, when technology and social media was being hailed as a democratizing force that was being used by democratic activists, across Northern Africa and the Middle East, to organize in new ways, and that it had turned the tables against authoritarian forces. Now, I think that commentary has proven to be a bit short-sighted and maybe one-sided, but I think the reality is that technology itself is neutral. And can be both democracy affirming and can be harmful to democracy. We need to be better in thinking about the effect that new technology will have on democracy on the front end, so we can maximize its upsides and minimize its downsides.
A little bit more regulation then on the Silicon Valley front?
I think we probably need some smart regulation. I think we need to be a little bit careful here.
Are the Europeans leading with things like GDPR?
The Europeans are certainly leading the conversation. I'm not sure that everything the Europeans are doing is the right model for the United States, but I think that the US is largely absent from that conversation.
Final question, we always end this way in these conversations. If there's one thing that we can do, maybe not tomorrow, but in the next few months or next year or two, to protect democracy, what is it? Something doable, something that if we all agree on, we can actually realize. What would it be?
Participate, I think, to be very generic.
You mean go out and join your local political party, your local community, your local organization?
There's many different ways of doing it, right? And so it's everything from engaging your elected officials to joining a party, to taking to the streets if you disagree with something. I think there's, or to listening to your neighbor with a different perspective. There's many, and frankly, voting, right? Voting is maybe the most important.
So be political.
Well, be engaged. I think that
participate in democracy.
Participate in democracy. I think there's a distinction between participating in democracy and being political. I think that we can have a discussion about what the distinction there is, but I think that people are largely turned off by politics. But the only way to change politics is by participating in our democratic system.
So what you're saying is switch off CNN and MSNBC and Fox, get off Facebook, and join a local community. Very good advice, I think.
I mean, I didn't frame it that way, but I think that that's not a bad set of recommendations for folks to think about.